Welcome to South Carolina's role in the Seminole War. Before we look at South Carolina's involvement, it helps to understand what the Seminole War actually was. The war took place between 1835 and 1842 in Florida and was fought between the United States government and the Seminole people, who resisted forces' removal from their land. The conflict is considered one of the longest and costliest Indian wars in American history. Tension grew after the Indian Removal Act and the U.S. pushed to relocate the Seminoles west. Violence erupted, and what followed was a long, brutal war fought in swamps, forests, and harsh terrain. This is the backdrop for understanding why states, including South Carolina, sent volunteers and militia units to support the U.S. Army. In this episode, we're going to explore how South Carolinians understood the Second Seminole War through their local newspapers, and what these sources reveal about the volunteers who fought and the communities who served them. Even though the war took place in Florida, the conflict felt much closer to home for people in South Carolina, and the newspapers from the 1830s show exactly why. Segment 1. Fear and Escalation. Let's start with the earliest reports. One of the first articles I looked at comes from the Cheraw Gazette on February 2nd, 1836. It warned that Seminole forces were, quote, 2,500 strong, and that attacks were happening within 40 miles of St. Mary's, right on the Georgia border. To readers in South Carolina, this didn't feel like a faraway war. It felt like a regional crisis moving north. Another paper, the Cheraw Gazette again, on May 24, 1836, described the situation as a perfect Seminole War fast approaching, adding that Georgia's forces were mobilizing. These newspapers weren't just reporting the news, they were shaping fear, urgency, and the expectation that southern states, including South Carolina, might need to get involved. Segment 2. Federal Failures and Public Criticism. But beyond the fear of the conflict spreading, South Carolina newspapers also focused heavily on what the federal government was or wasn't doing about the war. From the Cheraw Gazette of February 9, 1836, readers learned that Congress was debating a $500,000 emergency appropriation to suppress the hostilities. That's a huge amount of money for the 1830s. And its appearance in the newspaper shows how closely South Carolinians followed federal decisions. Then, on December 31st, 1836, the Camden Journal printed reports criticizing General Winfield Scott's failed campaign in Florida. According to the paper, the failure wasn't because of strategy, it was because troops lacked food, clothing, and basic supplies. So South Carolinians were reading about a war that was expensive, poorly supplied, and increasingly out of control. Segment 3. Diplomacy, Logistics, and South Carolina's role. The newspapers didn't just cover battles and failures, they also highlighted attempts at diplomacy and regional cooperation. One fascinating example comes from the Camden Commercial Courier on November 11, 1837. It reported that the Cherokee Nation offered to mediate between the U.S. government and the Seminoles. That's a native nation trying to reduce conflict between another native nation and the United States. This made a powerful moment that the paper made sure South Carolinians knew about. Another article from November 18, 1837 described how two steamboats, the American and Izard, were sent to Pensacola and refitted specifically for the Seminole War. This reminds us that wars aren't just about soldiers. They're about supply chains, transportation, and preparation. And in August of 1837, the Cheraw Gazette praised Colonel Warren for his distinguished military services in our protracted Seminole War. So South Carolina newspapers weren't neutral observers. They actively celebrated the state's participation. Segment 4. Connecting to administrative records. To understand the full picture, I also looked at the sources collected by another student, Stephen. While my sources were all newspapers, his came from government documents, petitions, and pension files. For example, the pension application of Isabella Register shows how families sought compensation long after the fighting ended. John A. Calgo's petition for reimbursement for horses he provided to a volunteer company shows the financial burdens civilians took on to support the war. There are even records of South Carolina volunteers helping construct fortifications in Florida and documents on Colonel Goodwin's Mountain Militia's Regiment. When you place Stephen's sources next to the newspapers I studied, you see both sides of the story. My sources show the public conversation, and his show the behind-the-scenes realities. Together, they reveal how deeply South Carolina was involved in a war that most people today barely remember. Segment 5. Why a podcast works. So why present this research as a podcast? Because public history isn't just about storing documents. It's about making them meaningful for people today. A podcast lets listeners hear the actual language of the 1830s, follow the sequence of the war, and understand the emotions, fears, and debates that shaped South Carolina's view of the conflict. It also gives voice to the volunteers and families who have, as many say, been erased from the landscape of memory. By translating these newspaper reports into a narrative that anyone can follow, a podcast brings forgotten soldiers and forgotten perspectives back into public awareness. Closing. The Second Seminole War is often remembered as a Florida conflict, but these South Carolina's newspapers show a very different story. They reveal fear, frustration, diplomacy, pride, and a deep regional investment in a war that shaped the American South. And that's why telling this story, especially through a format like a podcast, matters today. Thank you for listening to The Forgotten Soldiers, South Carolina in the Seminole War. This has been a look at how one state saw a distant war up close, and how everyday sources can help us remember the people who lived it.